My name is Ethan, and this is the story of the night my life shattered, and strangely, the same night it truly began. Before I tell you everything, let me ask you this. Have you ever been pushed away by the very people who were supposed to love you the most? If this story moves you, hit subscribe so more people can hear it too. Now, here's what really happened. I never thought my parents would be the ones to betray me, but I'll never forget the moment. My father's voice thundered across the living room, my mother's eyes cold and unflinching as she echoed his words. Leave the house key, take your suitcase, and get out. For a second, I just stood there, frozen. My heart pounded in my chest as if it wanted to break free. The home I grew up in, the walls filled with childhood laughter, suddenly turned into nothing but a prison throwing me out. Neighbors peeked through their windows as I dragged my suitcase across the porch. Some whispered, some only stared. Their silence was louder than any insult. Each step away from the house was heavy, humiliating, unbearable, but deep inside something whispered, "This isn't where your story ends." As I walked farther from the house that had just disowned me, my mind drifted back to the beginning, the place where the cracks first showed. I remember being 8 years old, sitting on the edge of the dinner table chair, swinging my legs because they never quite reached the floor. My father's eyes were always on my older brother, Daniel. "Look at him," Dad would say proudly, his voice filled with approval. "Strong shoulders already. He's going to make something of himself." But when his gaze shifted to me, it was different, cold, dismissive, as if he had already decided I was a disappointment, even before I grew old enough to prove otherwise. Mom wasn't much different. She praised my sister, Claire, for every little thing, her grades, her singing, even the way she folded napkins. But when I brought home my drawings from school, hoping she'd see something in me, she only sighed. "Art doesn't put food on the table, Ethan. Stop wasting your time." Those words stayed with me longer than I wanted them to. They made me hide my sketchbooks under the bed, as if creativity was a shameful secret. The truth was, I wasn't the son they wanted. Daniel was the strong one. Claire was the bright one. Me, I was just the extra one. And now, standing in the night with nothing but a suitcase, I realized they had finally acted on what they'd always felt. I was never truly theirs. I dragged my suitcase down a street that suddenly felt twice as long. Every streetlight threw my shadow too big and thin, like someone else's outline pasted to my heels. I had nowhere to go, not really. My phone buzzed with missed calls from numbers I didn't want to answer. My parents' message replayed in my head like a tape I couldn't stop. "Leave the house key, take your suitcase, get out." A friend, Maya, texted me around midnight. "Can you crash here? I've got a couch." I didn't want to be a burden, but I also couldn't sleep in the cold hum of the bus stop. I accepted because the alternative was worse, aimless wandering and the weight of that slammed door. Maya's apartment was small and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee. She pushed 2 pillows into the corner of the living room and handed me a blanket like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Don't be dramatic, Ethan. You can stay as long as you need," she said, with the kind of casual warmth I'd longed for when my parents called me disappointing. I sat on that thin couch and felt the springs complain. I hadn't felt them since college dorms, years ago, when life still promised paths, not dead ends. My stomach buzzed with hunger I couldn't satisfy with pride. The last thing I'd eaten was a hastily made sandwich before leaving. Now it felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Sleep came and left in jagged breaths. I woke to the murmur of morning traffic and a hollow ache in my chest. The shame wasn't loud. It was quieter, the kind that sits like dust on everything. My clothes, my thoughts, the suitcase at my feet. I washed my face in Maya's tiny bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. The reflection was the same, but somehow smaller, like the edges had been shaved off my confidence. I tried calling my brother, no answer. I texted, but the typing bubbles never came. I thought about walking back, pleading, explaining, anything to erase the look on my father's face. But what would I say? Forgive me for being me? It felt impossible. Days bled into each other. I took odd jobs, waiting tables, folding laundry at a laundromat, delivering packages on a bike. The work was honest, but every dollar I earned felt like a bandage over something much deeper. I was tired in a new way, bone-level exhaustion that coffee couldn't fix. At night, when I lay on Maya's couch and listened to her quiet breathing, I would stare at the ceiling and try to stitch together who I was without the people who'd defined me. There was a moment on a rain-slick Tuesday when everything cracked. I'd taken a double shift at the diner and came home smelling of fryer oil and bleach. I sat on the couch, and the room spun in slow film. The suitcase beside me felt heavier than granite. I pulled out my sketchbook, one of the few things I hadn't hidden, and flipped through pages of doodles and half-finished drawings. My childhood lines, the cartoons I loved, the landscapes I'd once believed I could make real. I thought of my mother saying, "Art doesn't put food on the table." I thought of my father's distant pride for Daniel that never included me. My chest tightened until I couldn't breathe. For the first time since that night, the questions that had stayed polite became sharp, urgent knives. "Am I really worthless?" I whisper, and into the dark, and the apartment answered with silence. The sob started small, a hitch, then burst into something that felt like being set on fire from the inside. Tears stung my eyes. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the page. I cried not only for the door that closed behind me, but for all the doors that had been quietly shut, while I smiled and tried to belong. I cried for the years I'd swallowed my voice, because it wasn't the one they wanted to hear. When the crying finally slowed, exhaustion took over. There was a strange clarity in that spent emptiness. Somewhere under the humiliation and the ache, a slow, fierce ember glowed. It wasn't hope so much as a truth that had been waiting. Being pushed out didn't erase who I was. If anything, it exposed a space where something else could grow. I curled myself around the sketchbook like it was a fragile animal, and, for the first time that week, let myself think, maybe this is where it starts. The morning light slid through the blinds in broken stripes, cutting across my face as I blinked awake on the couch. My sketchbook was still in my arms, its pages crumpled from how tightly I'd held it overnight. I was groggy, heavy, like my body had been carved out of stone. That's when my phone buzzed. Once, twice, then again. I groaned, fumbling to grab it from under the blanket. The caller ID lit up across the cracked screen. The bank. I frowned, sitting up. My mind raced. Why would a bank call me? I wasn't late on bills, mostly because I didn't have any worth calling bills. No mortgage, no credit card with a balance big enough to trigger alarm bells. In fact, the last thing I expected was a bank having anything to do with me. For a second, I thought it might be a scam. Some telemarketer trying to trick me into giving away the few dollars in my checking account. My thumb hovered over the red decline button, but something, maybe instinct, maybe sheer curiosity, made me hesitate. The number wasn't random, it was local. It had the name of an actual branch I'd passed by countless times. The buzzing stopped, my chest eased, until it started ringing again, the same number flashing insistently. A knot twisted in my stomach. Suspense built in the silence of the living room. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade, leaving just the sound of my pulse hammering in my ears. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. Why me? Why now? Finally, with my heart pounding, I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello?" My voice cracked, low and unsure. A pause. Then a calm, professional voice on the other end. "Good morning. Am I speaking with Mr. Ethan Cole?" I froze. Hearing my full name spoken like that, so precise, so official, made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Yes, this is Ethan," I said slowly. "Who's calling?" "This is Linda from First National Bank," the voice replied smoothly. "We need to confirm some urgent information with you regarding your account." I sat up straighter, confusion flickering into something sharper, suspense, even fear. "My account?" I echoed, my heart racing, because as far as I knew, I didn't have anything worth the urgency of a bank's call. The silence on the line stretched, heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. "Yes, Mr. Cole," Linda continued, her tone crisp but polite. "I'm calling to confirm some details on your business account. We've noticed you haven't accessed it in several months, and with new activity posted, we're required to verify everything is in order." I blinked hard, trying to piece her words together. "Business account?" "I think you might have the wrong person," I said, my voice shaky. "I don't own a business. You probably mean my father?" I stopped myself, the word bitter on my tongue. My father, my parents, the same people who had shoved me out the door less than 48 hours ago. "No, sir," Linda interrupted gently, almost as if she was used to this kind of denial. "The account is under your name. Sole owner, Ethan Cole." My grip on the phone tightened. "That can't be right," I whispered, My throat was dry, but I managed to force out a nervous laugh. I'm broke. I'm sleeping on a couch. I don't even own a car right now. How could I possibly have a business account? Linda's tone didn't waver. Mr. Cole, the records are clear. You are listed as the sole owner of Crestwood Property Holdings. The account has been active for several years. She paused, then added, It's tied to a commercial property downtown. Quite valuable. My head spun. My mouth opened, but no words came. For a long second, all I could hear was the pounding of my heartbeat against my ribs. Me? The owner? The words tumbled out of me like they belonged to someone else. Yes, she said firmly. We simply need you to verify your current address and schedule a time to review the account in person. I slumped back against the couch cushions, the phone pressed to my ear as disbelief swallowed me whole. Just 2 nights ago, I'd been standing in my parents' living room, hearing them spit the words, "Leave the house key, take your suitcase and get out." I'd walked out like nothing, like no one. And now, this, owner. The word didn't even feel real. It rolled through my mind like thunder, echoing in every corner of the hollow space my parents had carved out in me. For the first time in days, the tears welling in my eyes weren't from pain, but from something else, something I couldn't yet name, not hope, not yet, but maybe, the start of it. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay on the worn-out couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every single word from the bank call. Owner, sole owner, property holdings. The phrases rattled around in my skull like loose marbles. None of it made sense, until memories I had buried long ago started bubbling up. My grandmother, sweet old Grandma May, she was the only one who ever looked at me without judgment, the only one who ever told me I was special, even when my parents laughed it off. I remembered sitting at her kitchen table as a kid, the smell of her fresh-baked biscuits filling the air. "You've got more in you than anyone realizes, Ethan," she used to say, her hand warm over mine. "One day, when the world turns its back on you, you'll find out just how much you're worth." Back then, I thought she was just comforting me, but now her words sounded less like comfort and more like prophecy. I closed my eyes and pictured the day of her funeral. My parents had looked annoyed, more than sad. I'd overheard whispers about her estate, but nothing ever came of it, or so I thought. Unless... The realization struck like lightning. She must have left everything to me, not to her son, not to her daughter-in-law, to me. And my parents... Either they had no idea, or worse, they knew and tried to bury it. Maybe they assumed I'd never find out, never claim it. But fate had a cruel sense of timing. They had shoved me out the door, convinced I was worthless. And in doing so, they had kicked out not a failure, but the true heir, the rightful owner. I sat up slowly, my chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. A bitter smile tugged at my lips, one I didn't even recognize on my own face. "They kicked me out," I whispered to the empty room. Without knowing, I was the one who owned it all. The loneliness that had eaten at me for days began to shift into something else, something sharper. Not quite joy, not yet triumph, but power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the broken one. I was the one holding the secret that could change everything. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding heart and a fire in my chest I hadn't felt before. Fear still lingered, but it wasn't the kind that paralyzed me anymore. It was the kind that pushed me forward. I couldn't rely on phone calls. I needed to see it with my own eyes. The bank's glass doors loomed in front of me like the gates to another world. My palms were sweaty as I walked in, suitcase still at my side, as if it had become part of me. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked politely. "Yes," I said, voice steadier than I expected. "My name is Ethan, and I received a call yesterday about an account. They said I was listed as the owner of a property." She typed something into her computer, then glanced up at me with a hint of surprise. "Oh, yes, sir. Please wait a moment. Someone will be right with you." Minutes later, a man in a sharp suit appeared and ushered me into his office. He introduced himself as Mr. Hall, a senior officer. My knees felt weak as he slid a thick folder across the desk toward me. Inside were documents, pages and pages of them, all stamped and signed, all with one thing in common: my name, owner, sole proprietor, heir. I traced the letters with my finger as if they might vanish. My throat tightened. This is real? Mr. Hall gave me a sympathetic smile. "It's very real, Ethan. The property deeds, the business accounts, they're all in your name. Your grandmother was very specific in her will. She wanted you, and only you, to inherit. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't let them fall. Instead, I reached for the pen he placed in front of me. My hand trembled as I signed the first paper, then the second, and the third. Each stroke of ink felt like a piece of my old self dying, and a new version of me being born. By the time I set the pen down, something had shifted deep inside me. I wasn't just the kid my parents threw out anymore. I was the owner, the one in control. The first step into power had been taken, and there was no turning back. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying my suitcase like a badge of shame. I walked into a leasing office with my head held high and signed for my own apartment. It wasn't a penthouse or anything fancy, but it was mine. 4 walls, a key that belonged to me, and a door I could close without fear of being told to leave. The first night I slept there, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my chest rising and falling with something I hadn't felt in weeks: peace. The next morning, I stood in front of a mirror in a small clothing store. My old clothes hung off me like reminders of rejection. I tried on a crisp shirt, something I never would have dared before. When I buttoned it up, it felt like armor. Then came proper shoes, a blazer. For once, I didn't look like the outcast my parents had painted me to be. I looked like someone who belonged. As days turned into weeks, I found myself changing in ways that went beyond the surface. I was eating better, walking taller, even smiling at strangers. At night, I'd sit by the window of my apartment, the city lights reflecting in the glass, and whisper to myself, "They said I was nothing. They said I didn't matter, but look at me now. I own more than they could ever dream of. And this is just the beginning." The pain of rejection hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into fuel. A fire burned inside me now, one that whispered, "Rise higher, prove them wrong, show them who you really are." And for the first time, I believed I could. It didn't take long before the whispers began to spread. In small towns, secrets don't stay hidden, and even in the city, gossip has a way of traveling faster than truth. One evening, as I was reviewing documents in my new apartment, my phone buzzed with a message from an old neighbor. "Your parents look like they've seen a ghost. They just found out about the property in your name." I froze, rereading the words. For a moment, I could almost picture it, the shock on their faces, the disbelief. My parents, the same ones who had tossed me out with a suitcase, now realizing I wasn't some failure struggling to survive, I was the legal owner of something bigger than anything they had ever achieved. I imagined the scene, my father gripping the armrest of his chair, muttering, "That can't be true." My mother pacing, her voice sharp with panic. "How could this happen? How could we not know?" And then, the inevitable, my phone rang. Their number lit up the screen. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small when I saw their names. I didn't feel the sting of their rejection. Instead, I felt power. I let the call ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Finally, I swiped to decline. Minutes later, a flood of messages came through. "We need to talk. This isn't what you think. Please call us back." I sat back in my chair, a slow, almost bitter smile forming on my lips. The same people who had told me I was worthless now wanted to reach me. The same parents who had shut their door in my beats were now pounding on mine, even if it was only through a phone screen. For the first time in my life, I realized the truth. They needed me now more than I ever needed them. It was a Saturday morning when the knock came. Heavy, relentless. The kind of knock that demanded attention. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a delivery. But when I opened the door, my heart dropped. There they were, my parents. My mother's eyes softened instantly, her lips curving into a smile that felt foreign. "Sweetheart," she said gently, as if the last words she had spoken to me weren't filled with venom. My father cleared his throat, his tone rehearsed, polite. "We thought we'd visit, just to see how you're doing." I stood frozen in the doorway, gripping the edge of the door so hard my knuckles turned white. For weeks I had dreamed of this moment, of what I'd say if they ever dared show their faces again. And now here they were, smiling as if nothing had happened. Inside me, 2 storms collided, anger and love. The child in me still longed for their approval, still wanted to believe maybe they cared. But the adult, the betrayed soul who had walked out with a suitcase and shattered pride, knew better. Finally, I found my voice, low and sharp. "You threw me out like trash," I said. each word deliberate. You told me to leave my key, take my suitcase, and disappear. And now, you want back in because I have something you want? My mother's smile faltered. My father's eyes narrowed, a flicker of the man I knew too well, calculating, prude, unwilling to bend. Silence stretched between us, heavy and raw. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the powerless child standing before them. I felt like someone who had survived, who had risen, someone who finally had the choice, let them in or shut the door for good. I stood there in the doorway, their faces half hidden in shadows, mine caught between fury and sorrow. My parents had always been my compass, but somewhere along the way, that compass had broken, shattering into pieces sharp enough to cut me every time I reached for love. And now, here they were, smiling, pretending. Inside me, a war raged. Revenge whispered in my ear like a sweet, dangerous song. They threw you out. They made you feel worthless. Let them feel the same emptiness. Let them beg. I could almost taste the justice, sharp and satisfying. But another voice, softer, steadier, rose up too. Forgiveness, not for them, but for me. For the child inside me who had cried into a pillow, wondering why they weren't enough. For the young adult who had walked out that door, humiliated but still breathing. Forgiveness would be proof that I was no longer chained to their cruelty. I looked at them, my parents who suddenly seemed so small, so fragile, my mother clutching. Her purse like a lifeline. My father, once proud and unbending, shifting uncomfortably as if the ground beneath him no longer felt solid. For the first time, I held the power. Would I crush them with it, or release myself from their hold altogether? I realized then that this wasn't just a choice about them. It was about who I wanted to become. I drew a slow breath, steadying the storm inside me. My parents were waiting, expecting me to bend, to fall back into the child who always wanted their approval. But that child was gone. I lifted my chin, my voice calm yet unshakable. You threw me out with nothing. You made me believe I was worthless. But look at me now. I don't need your approval anymore. Their eyes flickered, guilt flashing, and then quickly buried under pride. My father opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand, stopping him. This time, I said, every word sharp as glass, I decide who enters my life, and the key is mine now. The silence that followed was heavy, final. For the first time, I wasn't standing outside their door begging to be let in. I was the one holding the door, deciding whether it would ever open again. And in that moment, I chose dignity. I chose me. The first morning in my new apartment felt like stepping into another lifetime. Sunlight streamed through wide windows, painting the walls golden. For once, I wasn't waking up in fear of being scolded, judged, or dismissed. This space was mine, every corner of it. The bank meetings were no longer intimidating. They were empowering. The business that had once felt too big for me was now a challenge I embraced. I studied, I listened, and I grew. Slowly, I transformed from the abandoned child into a capable owner. But what mattered most wasn't the wealth or the title. It was the people I surrounded myself with. Friends who had stood by me when I had nothing now sat at my table, laughing, eating, filling my home with warmth I had never known in my parents' house. Hope replaced the emptiness inside me. Pride replaced the shame they had planted in me. As I stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, I whispered to myself, they said I was nothing, but I became everything they could never imagine. When I look back at that night, the sound of their voices cold and sharp, telling me to leave the key and get out, I no longer feel the sting. Instead, I see it for what it truly was, the moment my freedom began. Their rejection, as cruel as it felt, was the doorway I never would have opened on my own. It pushed me into a life that was waiting for me, a life where I was not just surviving, but thriving. I realize now that sometimes the very people who turn their backs on us are unknowingly setting us free. What I thought was the end of everything was actually the beginning of me. To anyone listening, I want to say this. Sometimes rejection is redirection. Trust that life is guiding you somewhere better, even if it hurts at first. I want to leave you with one last thought. What would you do if your own parents pushed you out, told you to leave the key behind, and shut the door on you? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your story, your feelings, your truth. And if this journey touched your heart, don't forget to hit subscribe. Because every story I share here is meant to remind you that even in the darkest moments, there's always light waiting on the other side.